Good morning, everyone. We are live this morning. Looking forward to chatting today with Saleema. This is going to be such a great conversation. I actually came across her unexpectedly. She sent me a message and we connected immediately because I just love what she's talking about. She's talking about design thinking. So, as you know, here at Rework Work, we love to talk about anything that is inclusion, diversity, belonging, equity. And so this falls right up our alley today. And so I'm going to go ahead and introduce Saleema. Saleema, tell us a little bit about you and how you got into this area of design thinking.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much for having me, Stacey. So yeah, my name is Saleema Vellani, and I'm an innovation strategist. I have a few different hats, like a serial entrepreneur, so generally wear a few different hats. I teach design thinking at Johns Hopkins University, and I'd say I actually kind of fell into the design thinking space pretty much by accident. I've been working a lot with different organizations, helping bring innovation. We work with a lot of entrepreneurs with my current company, which actually recently pivoted where we're during COVID, where we're actually supporting a lot of other entrepreneurs, especially coaches, consultants, people that are really trying to have an impact and increase their influence. And we use really innovative strategies using processes like design thinking to get there. But as I mentioned, design thinking kind of happened by accident because a few years ago at this event, a global event actually, someone asked me, hey, we need a design thinking facilitator. Do you know anyone, or are you willing to do it? And I started reaching out to my network. And it was interesting because even when I was teaching one of my classes at Johns Hopkins, I was teaching entrepreneurship. I had this slide on design thinking, and I never really knew how to explain it to students because I kind of read up on it a bit. It didn't really I was like, what is this design thinking thing? This was like a few years ago when it wasn't as big as it is now. And I had to, I couldn't find a facilitator for that event. And so I was like, well, it was a good relationship. I was like, well, let me go ahead and try to figure this out. They're like, can you teach it? I was like, I'm not trained in it, but I can learn anything pretty fast and figure this out. So I got a colleague of mine. We studied it intensively as much as we could. And, watched a lot of Stanford videos, tried to figure it out. And we went for it. And we worked with another facilitator and we made it happen. And it was a really, really big success. So it's interesting. As soon as I did that gig, that kind of opened up the doors to the design thinking world for me, which was really big a couple of years ago. I do a bit less of it now, but it was really big in 2018, 2017.
Right. So back up a little bit. And for people who are listening today, tell us, what is design thinking? You said you had to explain it to students. So explain it to us as if we were students.
Okay, sure. So design thinking is really just a creative process to solve any type of complex problem. So any type of problem that is generally, there's not a predictable solution. Generally, there's some level of complexity involved where it's not, something that can just be solved pretty linearly. It requires, a lot more digging and trying to figure out how can we solve this problem. And so it's, think of it like a big, hairy problem. And generally, I can go into this a lot deeper, but basically any type of complex problem where you need to really try to understand more about the problem instead of trying to come up with a solution. Design thinking is basically the process of trying to understand the problem there's different processes, but I'd say the most important thing is really starting with, or what they usually start with is empathy. I kind of argue this in my book where I say it takes another level of really trying to understand yourself and having self-awareness in order to have empathy. But traditionally, design thinking starts with, according to Stanford's process, empathy, and really trying to understand your user, really trying to understand the person you're trying to design a solution for.
So you mentioned your book and you mentioned that you're working on this. So now, how does design thinking then relate to diversity and inclusion?
Sure, yeah. So
you've got a really interesting take on inclusion and how design thinking, it brings innovation.
Yeah, so I think design thinking is an interesting process. I think it's one tool or one process, one approach. It kind of gives you a process, especially for people that really want to or need to have that sort of mindset shift in the way they think, so they can think more divergently instead of thinking more linearly, this is the problem, this is the solution. Design thinking really allows us to open up our mind, because in the innovation space or being an entrepreneur, you're like, all solutions, anything, all ideas are possible. We can make anything happen. Let's just open it up. Let's not put any constraints. Let's not put any, let's be aware of our biases. And there's a lot of connections there between innovation, design. I'd say more than even just design thinking, it's innovation and diversity and inclusion. since design thinking is just one component of innovation.
Gotcha. So now people can pre-order your book, personally signed copy, right? Called Innovation Starts with I. Love that title. And so we will drop a link in there so you can take a look and go to Saleema's page and be able to pre-order. But so we at Rework Work, we are so passionate about inclusion and diversity. And we have been having so many conversations around how do you move the needle? Good morning, Ingrid. How do you move the needle? And I think that what happens here is, like you said, design thinking is one tool. And what we try to do at Rework Work is simplify, right? Because what I always hear is, you mentioned a big, hairy, audacious problem, right? Or your BHAG, your big, hairy, audacious goal, right? That's kind of, trying to create an inclusive workplace is kind of like a BHAG, right? Like you really are trying to get to this big goal, which seems insurmountable at times. And many people are thinking like, wow, how are we going to get there? We just don't think we're going to do it. And so I think design thinking is one way, right? And some of the things that we're doing, we're doing coaching, we're doing, assessments, and we're going sort of deep into organizations. But if you were working with an organization and you were going to use design thinking to maybe help them achieve that goal, what might you start with?
Yeah, sure. So I think that what happens is a lot of organizations tend to say, well, let's start with a design thinking workshop. Let's start by educating our employees on what design thinking is. And I think that's important. That's where a lot of the work that I used to do, I do less of it now, but I did a lot of that. Like the last few years was a lot of, hey, can you teach us design thinking? We want to shift the mindset of our employees. We want them to sort of, think more like an innovator. We want them to think more like entrepreneurs. And so we'd go in and facilitate a workshop and start with a really concrete, an example that they can all relate to. Like, for example, let's design your ideal travel bag if it's like a group of international professionals. And so it would just be really fun to see everyone interact and get hands-on and just be in different groups, really get uncomfortable, I'd say. And it was interesting because they learned a lot about design thinking. We would have like a slide deck. We'd make it fairly experiential, really interactive, really hands-on. And they'd walk away. They'd be like, oh, this was so fun. Oh, like I experienced that mindset shift. I ended up designing a solution for someone else instead of, trying to understand their perspective. And so it's really a way of trying to understand someone else's perspective without, just instead of going into your own self all the time, which we tend to often do is we often try to, well, it's natural. We're human. We tend to see the world as, through our own lens based on our own experiences. And so being aware of our biases, whenever, you're working with like a partner in the workshop and they're telling you about their problem and you're going to design a solution for them, you really want to know you have to learn how to ask really good questions. You have to learn how to get the information you need to come up with different ideas and solutions. And that process is really about opening up our mind and learning how to empathize. And where I argue that, yes, there's a lot of design thinking workshops. Do they actually lead to innovation? Yes, they do, create some level of mindset shift. Is it sustainable? And that's where I decided to write my book, because I noticed that there was a lot of, people just doing design thinking workshops, but then did it really lead to that much innovation? Because innovation can happen with teams and communities and doing workshops and sprints. But ultimately, I think the actual process of innovation, it starts like the input of innovation starts with the individual, and then it happens with teams and communities. And I think not enough organizations were focused on that human skill, sort of individual personal development aspect for their employees.
Completely agree, because it's a thing we talk about with our clients now, and we're saying, look, you have to realize that what we're trying to do is come in and change the way that we basically communicate with each other. But when you have individuals who are having a really tough time, getting through the normal parts of our day, right, and respecting one another, it's very hard to then come in and say, we're going to add this additional layer of complexity on top of it. And I realize that's why people say it's hard, because what they're looking at is changing behavior. And most people, even if they're not the greatest person in the world, they're like, what, I'm happy with who I am. I'm good. I don't really want to have to do too much more to make a change, right? And I think that's what we do is we're requiring people to change, and change is hard. People are stubborn. And so I think the interesting thing about design thinking is it can make it fun, right? You can give them a project. You can even take it away from diversity and inclusion. Like you said, you could think about something completely different, a travel bag, a new kind of ball. It would be interesting to do design thinking around how to teach students this school year, right? Now that they're not in physical classrooms, right? You can imagine a design thinking problem around that. So I think that that's part of like, how do we make creating solutions fun and not make it one of these things like, oh, this is drudgery, this is going to be awful, this is, because everyone builds up this sort of negativity towards it so that they have all of these walls and these mind blocks about it. And I think you mentioned, it is part of the perspective change. So like our unconscious bias course, I say our because we work, I think of us as a collaborative, but technically I did write it. So my unconscious bias course has been helping a lot of people kind of get through and see, really start to open their minds, right, to different perspective changes. And I am finding, and I don't know if you're seeing this, Saleema, but because you spend a lot of time doing a certain type of work, you get accustomed to talking to people who know about it. You get accustomed to having conversations about it. And then when you do talk to people who have no idea what you're talking about, you kind of are shocked for a moment. You're like, wait, what do you mean you don't know what this is? And then you have to remember, oh yeah, that's right. The example I'm thinking of is yesterday I was having a conversation with somebody about hair. And I said, oh, I went to get my hair braided, right? And so we were talking about black hair and what that's like. And they were saying, well, I had to explain to somebody why it's not okay for them to touch someone's hair. And I was like, are we still having this conversation in 2020? And she goes, yeah, she really didn't know. She was completely just oblivious and just astounded at the fact that I told her that it wasn't okay for her to do this. So I'm curious, you must come across this a lot as you're kind of going through design thinking and talking to people about what it is that you're doing.
Yeah, no, it is. So it is a thing where and that's interesting. I like what you said earlier when you started when you started talking was like, oftentimes when we think of like diversity inclusion training, or as soon as we have the word D&I, there's like it's kind of, we're now in a maturity phase of, the D&I, like it is still a buzzword. It still is really important, but there's a certain level of bias when it comes to when you hear diversity and inclusion, and right. Certain, stereotypes, generalizations, like feelings that come up. And so it's like, oh, sometimes it's the check in the box. Sometimes for employees, it's like, oh, that training. And then there's a certain feeling associated with that. And so I think design thinking gives us the opportunity to disconnect from that. It's sort of like, it's not about necessarily, it's so connected to diversity and inclusion, but it's not necessarily about that. Like if that's not the goal or the focus, but it actually does a lot. Sometimes it can do a lot more than just be like, hey, do this D&I training, watch these videos and the typical stuff that you have to check on the box. But like when you actually do stuff like design thinking, it actually opens up your mind and you bring in a lot of the concepts that we learn, especially around like unconscious bias, like being aware of how we perceive things, how we perceive others, how we perceive ourselves. Because ultimately with design thinking, if you're solving a problem or you're an entrepreneur trying to address something or trying to build something, you really have to understand the perspectives of others, your customers, the people you're trying to solve a problem for. And I think just that cognitive process does wonders in the D&I space.
Yeah, and I see Stacey says that Stacey Verson says she's tuning in and learning a new concept. She's never heard of this non-linear process, and now she has something new to explode her brain. So I think that's great. This is why I do these live sessions, just to be able to introduce, new concepts, new people. And so I think what I'm curious about for you, Saleema, because I think that my background makes me a good facilitator of unconscious bias and of uncomfortable conversations, right? Because being born in London, having parents that grew up in Guyana, having a different cultural background, moving to New York, living in New York, which is completely, very melting pot, right? And then now living in California, I feel like the different experiences that I have help me to see those different perspectives and help me to have these conversations, and it makes me a better facilitator. I think, would you say the same about your background?
Definitely. I'm actually from Toronto. And so, yeah, grew up in Canada, but lived around the world as I was trying to search for home. I was trying to figure out what that meant for me for many years. And so I lived out of I lived in Brazil. I lived in Brazil twice, in Rio de Janeiro. I lived in Italy, both in the south, all the way at the toe of the boot in front of Sicily, in Calabria. And I lived in Bologna. Lived in the Dominican Republic, on different parts of the islands, so spent time in the Caribbean, all over. I've been to over 70 countries. And even though for me that's normal, like a lot of the things, a lot of the adversities, a lot of the, experiences abroad, a lot of the things I've been through in my life are very unique to me, but they're also all I know. And so it's part of my story. And so it does shape the way that I think. Just speaking multiple languages for me is normal to me, and quite normal for a lot of the people in my field in international development. And because, we work a lot with different countries. And so for me, that's nothing that new, because it's me. But then it was interesting as I started to move out of my field, out of international development, which, as an economist in one of my former careers, worked a lot with international. I still do to some extent, but that was like my thing. Was I was working in that field, and I was surrounded constantly by other international development professionals, and that's all I knew. And so when I stepped out of my field into the startup world, I went into the private sector, worked for a Silicon Valley company. My office has moved to like WeWork from a traditional office space. And everything shifted. I was like, oh, wow. Like now I'm working a lot more with Americans and different cult. Like it's not the same as the international space I was in before. And I realized that people thought it was quite different, that I spoke multiple languages, that I'd seen so much of the world. And I didn't realize that I think it was kind of stepping out of my comfort zone, out of what I knew was normal to me, to help me realize how other people perceive me, because sometimes we're just used to our own tunnel, our own, our own groups, our own communities, or our own niche. And so that was a really interesting experience, bringing a lot of what I had from one area to another, where it was more unique and quite interesting, actually.
Yeah, it definitely is, to be able to travel, right? Like, I think that's one of the things that I have looked at, and I use that as a barometer, a yardstick, right? To say, okay, if you can get out and travel, it does require, right, some level of privilege. You've got to be able to afford to get a passport. You have to have an idea of countries and want to go somewhere, and some kind of like wanderlust. And I think that it always, astounds me when I meet people who haven't gone anywhere, they've never traveled, they don't own a passport. And I always think, wow, like that's just so strange to me, because I've always had a passport, because being born in London and then traveling to the United States a lot to see family, I had a passport at the age of 2. So you've just always done it. But it always helps me to remember and remind myself that, what, everyone has a different story. Everyone has a different lens, and everyone's got a different perspective. And even in those kinds of things, we have to suspend judgment, and also just remember that, like I said, everyone has a very different path. And you can't know what others have kind of been through. But it is interesting when you meet others who do have that sort of international flavor to their lives. I think the perspective is a little bit broader, because you have been to different countries, you've talked to different people, you've seen the way that people live in different ways, and you realize that, wow, my way is not the only way. Because, I think you said it earlier, Saleema, that we're very introspective. We kind of think about everything in relation to ourselves. So if what we know is like this big, then what we think about is going to be this big, right? So it's really important that we do learn these concepts, that we kind of get out and I won't say better ourselves, because it's not so much about bettering ourselves, but it is about improving and opening up and being more aware for others. And so tell us a little bit about the book. I'm going to drop the link again, because I want people to go to your page and pre-order. So tell us a little bit about what inspired you to write the book, and then tell us what we're going to get in this book.
Sure. So what inspired me to write the book, it was actually I'd been an entrepreneur, earlier when I was in Brazil and all those places. And it's funny you talk about like privilege and stuff, but I actually found ways when I was young to do it, like whether it was studying abroad, volunteering in exchange for lodging or whatever it was. I always found ways to be really scrappy and live abroad. I never really actually got to do it fully as an expat. It was more in that scrappy, young, early 20s sort of way. And so interestingly, it was when I came back from my living abroad and I settled in Washington, D.C., I already, started a couple of businesses, sold a couple of them. And those were all out of necessity. Like I became an entrepreneur out of necessity. I was embarrassed about it because I couldn't find a real job. I had no real work experience like a lot of my classmates when I went to grad school. So I was, trying to make ends meet when I was living in places like the south of Italy. The Brazil, I helped as a volunteer start up a language school. It's a financial orphanage for a nonprofit, which today is at one of the, it's the number one Portuguese school in Brazil, and it's now a for-profit. Italy, similar situation. I couldn't find a job, and so I had to, do some translation work online just to survive, and it quickly turned into a really successful business by that having those pivots. It was all about those pivots, and it was when I came to the United States, I was like, okay, I'm going to finish grad school at Hopkins. I'm going to try the 9-to-5 thing. I want to actually get some real work experience. And I thought it'd have a bigger impact working at the macro level, working for a big international organization. And I realized very quickly that I felt really far from the impact. I kind of felt like I was like, what is my day-to-day work doing? And how is this making people's lives better? That's what I thought I was doing with my career and working for, someone else. And I realized very quickly that it's not that that's not possible, because I now see that with consulting work totally is. But at that time, I felt so stuck and I didn't know what else to do. And so I started writing this book actually in 2014, when I was trying to figure out like, how do I help unleash the entrepreneur within people? I saw that a lot of people were coming to me. They wanted to hear my story of my previous experience being an entrepreneur. I was hired as a storyteller for Silicon Valley company, would go and tell my story to entrepreneurs, but I couldn't figure out how to do it again. I was using my brain. I was using my head a lot. So I'm like, what problem can I solve? And I was like, I want to help other people unleash the entrepreneur within them. And that's when the book started in 2014. But quickly after I started writing the book, a few weeks later, a friend of mine was like, Saleema, like nobody knows who you are. You're not famous. If you write a book, it's just like, what are you going to do? Like, no one's going to read it. And you've accomplished some things and some really cool things, but still it's not enough. Like, you still have more to do. And I actually took it quite personally back then. It was like, oh man, like, I'm not good enough. I kind of really took it as a hit on my confidence. And I took a pause for 5 years. And in those 5 years, it was like a huge transformation. I had a whole experience where, some highs, some extreme lows, went through an entire, like my life crashed, this house burnt down, like a lot of things happened, and I had to rebuild myself. And it was when I went through that process of losing almost everything I had, that I had to redesign my life and turn that adversity into a really fulfilling, meaningful life. And it was when I achieved that, it took a couple of years, it took a few years. And it was when I achieved that, I was like, well, it's time to pick up that book project that I left for 5 years. And people kept asking me, Saleema, I want to hear your story. I started speaking on stages and sharing it, got more comfortable being vulnerable. And it was then that I was like, okay, this is time to make this happen. It is uncomfortable to write a book. It is uncomfortable to put a story out in the world. It is uncomfortable to deal with a physical product, given I was always in the virtual world. And I committed to it. I was like, let me build this team. Let me figure this out. Let me do what I'm best at. If I'm good at writing, I'm going to focus on that and get help with everything else that, I'm not great at, to make this a successful project. And it's called Innovation Starts with I. It's available right now on Indiegogo. It's available for pre-order. And so I'm actually going to be personally signing all the physical copies of the book. There's also ebooks. There's a digital workbook that's exclusive for people that are backing the campaign. And we're really trying to build a lot of community through this while we fundraise, to be able to help cover the cost of self-publishing. Something else that's happened is, the publishing industry is also going under a lot of changes with everything happening in the world. So I decided self-publishing would be the way to have the biggest impact and get my message out there, especially to the people and places that most need this message, that innovation starts with I. It starts with, knowing yourself, just as we talked about in this conversation.
It's awesome. I think it's it's a great story, and I can't believe, you said all that adversity. Did you really say your house burned down?
Yes, my building had a really bad fire, a 2 alarm fire a few years ago. And so I was displaced for about 6 to 9 months. Yeah.
Wow. So it just goes to show that you can rebuild and get everything back together. And I think the reason I really wanted to talk to you today is because, like you said, the innovation starts with I. And I think for me, diversity and inclusion, everyone calls it, they'll say D&I. And I think about it as disruption and innovation, because that's what we do when we come in. We disrupt the status quo and we help you to innovate. And so I think that I really believe that inclusion is what is going to help companies to get to that place where they innovate. All these companies that are saying, "Oh, we don't need to worry about it because we're making money." You're making money now, but it's not going to continue. It's not sustainable, and the way to make it sustainable is to innovate. So I think that I really, that's like what I'm trying to really bring home to everyone and have them understand that you have got to innovate. If you do not innovate, you will be like Blockbuster, because that's what's going to happen. Netflix is going to come and eat your lunch. So,
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that we are seeing a shift where at the end of the day, what is a brand? It's a community today. It's no longer just about your product or your service. It's the community that backs you. It's the community that you have and your customers, your employees. And I think that we're seeing people are choosing to work at places where there are inspiring leaders that are actually, making stuff happen, and movers and shakers that are really trying to, not just serve their customers, but really build a really, really, a really great culture within the organization. So I think the more diverse, your employees, your customers are, like, the more you're going to be able to innovate with your products, the more that you're able to cultivate that mindset, because people are just naturally exposed to different situations, different, just being uncomfortable. I think it's all about that.
yeah, definitely. Well, that is wonderful. Thank you so much. I think it was a great conversation. Appreciate everyone who showed up this morning to say hello and to chime in. Glad that you got some great nuggets from Saleema, and you'll get even more nuggets if you pre-order her book, which will be released shortly. When is it coming out exactly?
Yeah, so it's planned to come out in December. And that's the release date. We're still working on there's a lot of changes going on in the world with shipping and all of that. And so we're figuring it all out right now. But it will be available, yes, at the end of the year. It will be done and it will be released. And it's available on Indiegogo. So the link is in the chat. And there's other exclusive perks. We're also supporting some other small businesses through it, and as well as an artist who also does a lot of paintings and drawings on diverse women of color. And so her name's Sarah Golish. She's amazing. She did my drawing on the book cover and drew the eye, and so I wanted to give her a shout out as well.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you joining me today. This has been great. For those of you that were watching today, as usual, we will drop a link to this, and we would love it if you would share it with others so they can watch too and see what a rock star Saleema is. I think definitely, I think it was Stacey Wilson that said, "You're a rock star, Saleema," and I have to echo that. So again, thank you for taking the time to join me today.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. This is great. Have a wonderful day, everyone.
Thank you. You too.